It's my understanding that the inspiration for this conference came to Patrick Bellan, who many of you will know, after a routine request for some data about trees in Malmö. It was a request he'd made many times before, but this time, for whatever reason, the GIS specialist, and I'm afraid I don't know who that was, feel free to identify yourself with the credit if you're watching. This time the GIS specialist suggested they make a little app, so Patrick could get the information himself whenever he wanted. Patrick thought that sounds great, but wasn't expecting to hear more anytime soon, only for an email to pop up into his inbox 15 minutes later saying, "Here's your app." So Patrick thinks, wow, that's amazing, but if it was so quick, why didn't you make this years ago? To which the answer came, well, no one asked us to. We in the GIS community may need to be reminded occasionally just how new a lot of what we do still is for society as a whole. While those who have long appreciated the value to society of urban green space and urban trees might also understand that GIS has a lot of callers on its attention. From that perspective, urban forestry was a niche and, to be honest, a rather difficult application area for GIS to get involved with until recently, because we often didn't have the necessary data at the right scales. But that's changing fast. Thanks to the advent of mobile phones, GPS cameras, higher resolution satellite images, we can now start to answer a lot of the questions you might have. And in fact, this cartoon is out of date because there are apps that can identify bird species. Not only that technology is becoming more available to society as a whole, it's also that the idea or the roles, the use, the importance of urban green space and trees has become more understood by society. It's actually only 10 years since the concept of nature-based solutions was first promoted by the European Union as an approach to ameliorate the stresses on our environment and society from climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. Which is perhaps why the Nordic Council of Ministers thought now would be a good moment to fund the Yggdrasil project to assess how effectively NbS were being deployed across Scandinavia, in particular the 330-300 rule. I'll talk briefly about that rule later in this presentation, but actually that's not why I chose to use Yggdrasil in the title and the front page of my talk. It's because if we want to understand how different worlds merge together, how technology gets updated, it's worth looking at how this has occurred in the past. And I want to take us right back to the Vikings. So Yggdrasil is a sacred tree in Viking mythology. Those of you schooled in Scandinavia, I'm sure, know this better than I do. But for the rest of us, Yggdrasil is basically a big tree with its roots in Niflheim, the underworld, its trunk sticking through the centre of Midgard, where we live, and its branches reaching up to Asgard, the realm of the gods. That is how Vikings describe the world in the Edda poems, so we shouldn't be surprised if it was done with some poetic license. We know the Vikings did not believe, literally, the world was a flat disk with a tree stuck through it, because they sailed around a sizable part of the world and still found their way back home, carrying their trade goods, their plunder, and no doubt several of my own relatives. Yggdrasil and Midgard were not supposed to be a map of how the world is, but how the world works, which in their time was believed to be at the whim of the Norse gods. But it's interesting because we know the Vikings were mixing with cultures that had long experience in making cartographic maps. We can only speculate as to why a seafaring and literate people do not seem to have been much interested in them. Perhaps the maps they saw just were not accurate enough to be useful for navigation. But I wonder, when that longboat arrived at a Mediterranean port, about the time a map like this was available, if somebody had offered to sell the Jarl this new, very expensive piece of geoinformation technology, don't you think the navigator might have said, "But what do we need that for? I got you here, didn't I?" When mapping is a familiar and fascinating part of one's own daily work, it can be baffling and frustrating if others don't immediately see the potential. But it's helpful to remember that some of the greatest navigators in human history didn't see the need for them as a practical tool. And it would take centuries before their potential, even once they become geometrically quite accurate, it would still be centuries before their potential would be recognized as a source of evidence about the processes that drive how our world works. So, at local scales, maps had been fairly accurate for at least half a millennium before the first recorded use of them to answer the question of why something happens where it does. Since the pandemic, it has actually become quite common knowledge, I think, how John Snow mapped instances of cholera during an outbreak in London in 1854. He used this map to identify a water pump as its source. That also challenged an orthodoxy, miasma, which the medical establishment believed transmitted disease through bad air. Of course, one person's stubborn orthodoxy is another person's established best practice. Geoinformation science found itself central to many of the debates which took place during the COVID pandemic, this time under the spotlight of social media. And it arguably crossed the Rubicon when it moved from only informing public policy to being an active agent itself through things like the Track and Trace app, which could automatically issue a legally binding notice that you should self-isolate if your GPS track showed close proximity with someone who had tested positive. In 2004, the idea that you could find your friend's real-time location on a map was still literally in the world of magical fantasy. By 2005, you could find yourself on the map through Google Maps and therefore see what was around you, but they didn't introduce the ability to see anybody else's location. When it was introduced in 2011 by Apple, it was a controversial move to make. Today, well, Track and Trace was controversial. It wasn't allowed in Sweden, but the Find My Friends feature is seen as a convenient, even mundane part of everyday life. When we talk about the great hope of this arriving new technology, it can sometimes be quite hard to get a sense of what's really available today and what is still some time in the future. And if it is still in the future, are we talking tomorrow's world? Or is this just tech evangelism? Or is it something that's really going to change our streets over the next 5 years? So I've tried to set out when these various developments reached a point of maturity and accessibility that they could be potentially useful for urban green space planning and management of urban forests. I've highlighted in bold the ones I'm going to talk about first, which is essentially the benefits that came from arrival of precision GPS, particularly the fact that that then allowed use of drones, and before that, the benefits of new, higher resolution, more multispectral remote sensing information. Prior to the launch of the Copernicus Sentinel satellite, urban land cover analysis in general was really quite severely hampered by the resolution of Landsat, which was the best freely available multispectral data. Bearing in mind that 30 meters refers to the edge of the cell, so the cell is not 30 meters squared, it is 900 meters squared. That is larger than many urban features such as street width, individual houses, and trees. Individual pixels are therefore capturing the light from many different things, and all we get to see is the average result. This is a particular problem when you want to separate out trees from other vegetation. The NDVI calculation effectively measures the reflectance of chlorophyll, and while this is a bit different between lawns and tree canopy, it can be hard to find the border between the two. At 30-meter pixel resolution, we were restricted to mapping larger patches of greenery in general, and while that might be interesting at a policy level, it's not so helpful for on-the-ground management. Nonetheless, Landsat remains a useful tool for mapping of these larger vegetation features because, while it doesn't have the spatial resolution, it has a very long historical record, so you can look at change, provided you can work with that spatial resolution. When Sentinel arrives at 10-meter resolution in 2015, this all changed. Extracting tree canopy and even larger individual trees suddenly became quite a trivial task. With a 5-day return period, one can even establish some basic parameters, such as when each tree gains and loses foliage, or address scientific questions about how things are operating, such as the period of high temperature and drought, which would result in specific trees or types of species losing their foliage. The restriction on what questions we could ask of satellite data became less about spatial resolution in this context and more about the spectral resolution, i.e. the range of light frequencies the satellite can distinguish, known as frequency bands. Landsat currently has 8 bands. That's enough to see the difference between vegetation and hard surfaces pretty well, but not enough really to robustly identify, say, species or degree of leaf stress. NMAP is one of a new generation of hyperspectral satellites. It has 246 bands, so we should be able to see far more types of land cover. Although it does return to the 30-meter resolution like Landsat, you can see from this picture here that the supporting software includes pixel unmixing. That's a way to estimate more detail from within a larger pixel, so higher spatial resolution is possible. NMAP has already been used to map tree diversity in a European forest, distinguishing 11 different species. But interestingly, this was achieved without the need for any fancy AI analysis methods. It used long-standing statistical approaches common in most GIS. However, I expect there will be a trade-off between this level of thematic resolution, i.e. distinguishing tree species, and the higher spatial resolution that's achieved by pixel unmixing. So whether it will allow similar degrees of species classification in urban areas, I'm not sure. So we see the benefit of higher spatial resolution and higher spectral resolution. But then there's the question of temporal resolution. Worldview is a satellite series which is focused on the latter. It's got a new satellite going up this year that will show an improvement in spatial and temporal accuracy. With 5-meter spatial resolution, you can identify more and smaller objects, including smaller trees. But the impact is primarily relating to faster changing features, since the update period will be measured in hours, not days. In some places, it will be as little as 1 or 2 hours between images. Now, could that be useful for urban forestry? It certainly would suggest a very different timescale for management questions would become possible, perhaps more related to monitoring management of trees, timely investigation of illegal felling of trees, or something of that order. Or perhaps that is an example where maps will not yet be welcome, as it would be considered micromanaging or intrusion on privacy. There are so many satellites recently or about to be launched, I cannot possibly cover them all. According to the website Space Oscar, there have been 194 different Earth observation satellites launched since 2015. So I can't give you an overview of them all, and not all of these will be free or indeed easily available to the public. But you can browse the website to help you get to know what your options are. One more to watch is MIDAR, multispectral LiDAR, which allows highly detailed understanding of the amount and condition of biomass. Unfortunately, the GEDI series, yes, it is pronounced that way, the GEDI series does not cover most of Scandinavian latitudes. But when such a system is in place for Sweden, it will transform vegetation mapping in general and forestry in particular. And at the current rate of change, I don't think that will be too many more years. In the meantime, you could of course do it yourself. For urban areas, drones are both practical, affordable, and have particular advantages over satellite data. Resolution is probably the most important advantage. You can see here the difference in detail this provides. Drones provide for unprecedented accuracy down to millimeters if you really need it. So you can not only map where trees are, but characteristics such as branch structure, leaf density, and so on. But what is possible and what is practical or useful are not the same thing. Perhaps the greatest strength drones add is flexibility. You can choose your own sensors, make your own LiDAR if you want. On the other hand, satellites give you consistency and they give you a time series that might, in some cases, stretch back decades, like Landsat, and often it's entirely free. I struggled to place LiDAR in this presentation because it applies across vastly different scales, from global satellite sources to national coverages flown by aeroplane to detailed tree models from drones. It can be collected in orthographic view, i.e. top-down, which is the case for Sweden's national LiDAR data, or from the side, oblique views, but either way, once it's in the computer, you can view it from any angle. Top-down, it can be particularly useful to help extract trees from sentinel images based on the height difference. We did this for a paper that's just been accepted where we were looking at the role of urban green space and trees on university campuses in terms of whether there's any effect on student performance. So you can take it a few steps away and look at socioeconomic type questions or environmental sociological questions in that way. Or the LiDAR can be the primary source in its own right, such as this study from Sandupuoli et al., who used the tree structure itself to predict microhabitat availability. What satellites cannot do is see the world from your own perspective. Drones can gather images from the side, immersive images. Combined with AI, this can be converted from an image to relevant knowledge, including knowledge about trees. For example, LiDAR from above can measure crown density, but this paper on the left from 2022 is classifying trees by the apparent crown loss as it would be seen on the ground. Depending on the management approach, the two may not be the same, and the effect on ecosystem services like shading and windbreaks could also differ. Now, if track and trace crossed a Rubicon, how about track, trace, and treat? This drone automatically identifies diseased branches and then uses its chainsaw to prune them, bringing the samples back for testing. Now, if your first reaction was also chainsaw-wielding AI drones, I think I know how that movie ends, I should emphasize that this example is from the volcanic slopes of Hawaii, where there are other health and safety concerns to worry about. Our lawyers would probably appreciate me emphasizing also that neither I nor SLU are in any way suggesting it might be a good idea to send chainsaw-wielding drones to your neighborhood park. The relevance to this presentation is that the barriers to doing so are no longer technical, ethical, legal, plain common sense, but the technology is available to do so. Actually, artificially intelligent blade-wielding robots are already out and about in our parks in Sweden. Alnarpsparken, where I'm recording this, is patrolled by robotic lawnmowers which I now barely notice. But then again, my office is on the 3rd floor. The crest of the wave reaching urban planning is clearly artificial intelligence, which is reaching into many processes such as optical recognition of documents and digitalization of planning processes. But I'm just going to focus on a particular track which links AI analysis of images and simulation, both the two sources for parametric modeling. Parametric modeling provides future scenarios and visualizations of those scenarios. At the end, I'll then also briefly consider natural language processing as a potentially more intuitive way to interact with GIS. I want to preface the next section with a general observation on artificial intelligence in GIS. Allow me to introduce Professor Stan Openshaw, who taught me spatial AI at Leeds University. Now, his course was the hardest but also most fulfilling course I've ever taken. But I've never used any of the techniques that I learned there in practice. Why? Because in the late 1990s or early 2000s, there was little net benefit over the application of traditional spatial analyses or statistical methods. Society simply wasn't creating lakes of data for AI to swim around in, at least not on the kind of socio-environmental issues that I was investigating. But what I have applied throughout my career was his message around when and how to apply technology appropriately and ethically. Computers are really good at repetitive, detailed work, compiling, sifting, and pattern identification when it goes across data which is too large, too high dimensional for humans to understand. And he argued that as more and more data accrued, we would have a moral obligation to find the important patterns it contains, even if we as humans didn't have the time and capacity to give every aspect the attention it needed. In 2013, software to specifically measure various things like canopy transparency from ground-based photographs was adequate for the task without needing artificial intelligence. But they tended to be specific pieces of software for doing specific things, or at the very least, an extension onto a mainstream GIS software. That was because each represented a significant amount of code to maintain for a relatively few number of end users. AI changed the equation because an artificial neural network can be trained to find a lot of different kinds of patterns, including really subtle patterns that we humans naturally perceive, like birds, or how a tree crown looks like next to grass, flowers, other small trees, and so on. So a company like Esri can basically reuse the same fundamental code to provide, I think they now have more than 50 different types of artificial intelligence classifier. The subtlety with which classification can be done using AI also opens up options that don't just compete with traditional methods for things like crown identification. It can break new ground by finding patterns in data that are hard to even describe to a human being. For example, the branch structure of individual trees and the rules which govern that pattern for different species. If you can understand the rules that govern the way a tree branches into the pattern it does, or the way roads branch, or why houses end up looking the way they do in certain places, then you can use those rules to generate examples of the overall case. When it comes to trees, the paper that I showed previously looking at branch structure is trying to build new forms of billboard, which are traditionally used to model how trees would look in a 3D visualization, but are static, fixed in a particular point in their life cycle. If you understand the rules that govern their growth, you could have dynamic trees that can show the whole life cycle, and you could pick out visualizations at different points into the future. That is maybe still a few years away, but what's certainly already here is the ability to look at specific outcomes for general cases at a planning level. So if we think about land use zoning, for example, you can zone an area to have a certain amount of green space and certain kinds of housing, but the exact outcome depends on many, many different actors along the way: architects, homeowners, buyers, landowners, citizens, acts of nature, and so on. You can build these elements in so you can see different potential outcomes from the original zoning plan. That might help you catch unwelcome outcomes. It might help you explain to citizens a range of possible outcomes rather than just delivering one example which could potentially be utopian or unrealistic. A similar approach to that taken with extracting the pattern, the rule base behind tree branching, can also be used to speed up and make more user-friendly traditional process models of function. For example, on the left here we have NvMet, which can be used to model the effect of trees on things like wind flow. But parameterizing that is quite hard. It's not easy to find things like suitable local data on leaf area indices for local species. And actually running that process can take hours or even days. So it's not terribly appropriate in a design context where you're trying to engage citizens, for example. The app which Patrick can now use to get his tree data is a bit like a phrase book that allows anyone to ask a question, even if they do not speak the whole language. Phrasebooks work because a human being has conscientiously translated the phrase in a way which will not be misunderstood. Large language models offer the prospect of having a natural language conversation with GIS. And indeed, there have been prototypes developed that you can try online. But the problem I foresee is that geographical and analytical concepts are often not well expressed in natural language. There is no agreed definition of natural features such as lake, mountain, or concepts like what do we mean by nearby. So even if a language model can convert text into a computable query, there is almost infinite potential for misunderstandings. And I think we would want to be very careful before trying to use natural language to direct our urban canopy management system, especially if we want drones to be more actively involved on the ground. Not all the new technology is floating around somewhere up near Asgard. Another quiet revolution has been taking place that puts people at the center of geospatial analysis, be that as developers, as a community of open source alternatives to the major GIS vendors, or as collectors of open geodata via apps, be they for professional fieldwork or PPGIS to allow citizens to be more involved in both science and planning decisions. There's also the opening of publicly funded data sets so it's more accessible to ordinary people and other businesses. There's the open web. For a while, there was also social media, but that needed regulation, and we now have laws such as GDPR, and rightly so. Now, I want to preface this section by emphasizing that the complexities of working with geodata and the valid restrictions on what information about people we should be able to access does tend to emphasize the needs of people in general, with the risk of losing the perspective of different kinds of people. Public Participatory GIS, PPGIS, presents a useful counterweight to this problem, and it does not require cutting-edge technology. The map on the right shows differences in where women and men tend to go in Kungsparken in Gothenburg. This data was collected by a postal survey using paper maps on the grounds that this would ensure a fair response rate from those not so comfortable with technology. On the other hand, it's undoubtedly easier to use online services such as Maptionaire, and these do have the advantage of spatial precision. Plus, we're now in an age where younger people may find answering on paper more off-putting. These maps show the distribution of tweets from accounts visiting Pildammsparken in Malmö, compared with walking time to that park. We see that accessibility of this high-end city park is perhaps not as equitable as we might hope. Remember, the 300-metre rule is to high-quality urban green space, not any urban green space. This work was done prior to GDPR, but the data to make these maps was nonetheless stripped of all tweet content and account IDs before work began, so there was no way to identify who any one account was. And you can see that once aggregated against limited context maps, it really does not pose any risk to infringing privacy for the user. However, raw Twitter data certainly can potentially disclose private information, which is one reason why, with the introduction of GDPR, Twitter stopped providing the coordinate data this method needed, and the work had to be abandoned. Indeed, social media as a data source for academic study was significantly impacted by GDPR and scandals such as Cambridge Analytica. It is unfortunate that misuse of social media data by some led to such an erosion of public trust. Clearly, there were potential social benefits to be gained from its use. And that's an important lesson for early adopters of many of the different technologies that I've discussed today, particularly those encouraging users to interact with digital twins. Use these technologies with care, do not take public support for granted, waves draw back as well as roll in. I said at the beginning that I would briefly discuss the 330-300 rule. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it, but in brief, the rule suggests that everyone should have access to urban green space within 300 meters of their home, that the area around their home should have at least 30% tree canopy coverage, and that everyone should be able to see at least 3 trees from their home. The rule was first introduced by Professor Kninyendijk in 2021, and since then there have been lots of papers and discussions about how to operationalize this and quantify this in terms of GIS analysis. Most recently, Region Skåne released the 330-300 report for that region, and they developed their own method to do so. The Yggdrasil Living Nordic City project is aiming to create a standardized measure of this that can be applied appropriately across cities for the whole of Scandinavia. It'll be very interesting to see what method they propose to do this. But I think it's important to remember that the 330-300 rule is meant to be a starting point. It's saying that this should be typically the minimum level of urban green infrastructure we would expect a city to be able to provide for its population. It's not the same as saying any given individual should be satisfied with 300 meters distance to the nearest green space, or that this would be sufficient for that individual. Because as individuals, as humans, we do not all live in the same worlds, let alone in the same cities. Mobility is very individual, and research shows clearly that the effect of distance on the rate of use of urban green space is impacted by things like age, particularly with the very young and the very elderly. At those extremes, even 50 meters extra can make a real difference. So the 330-300 rule is about assessing whether or not the population as a whole, in general, has sufficient access to urban green space and ecosystem services arising therefrom. It's not the same as asking the question of whether the population has equitable access to urban green space. At such small scales as 50 meters, how one measures distance will impact your conclusions. As the crow flies, by the road network or in terms of walking time will affect apparent accessibility. But it might affect some people more than others, such as those for whom crossing a major road is a serious barrier rather than an inconvenience. How the selected distance metric affects apparent access also interacts with the definition of green space used. Because, as we see here, the definition impacts how much green space there is a little, but where is significantly affected. We see from the maps on the right that as minimum size increases, green space near buildings is often the first to be excluded from the definition, which obviously impacts apparent access for the least mobile particularly hard. Which is one of the many reasons why open data is so important, because it allows comparison of alternative sources and their respective definitions of green space and trees. Boverket's recently released canopy map is welcome, but it's not definitive. Malmo created its own canopy map based on a different methodology and unsurprisingly found slightly different results. Overall, statistically, the difference is only a few percent, but in specific places, that would be enough to tip some properties into or out beyond certain simple thresholds. Now, in terms of 330-300, it may not matter very much because Malmo is generally well covered within the 300 meter threshold. But if you drop that threshold by 50 meters, patches without green infrastructure do start to appear. And that's before you consider the quality of the urban green space or the quality of the urban forest, which is in the area of interest. For example, are the trees old? Are they better able to support, therefore, biodiversity, or clean the air better, or provide more cooling, compared to maybe the same total area, but comprised of smaller individuals, younger individual trees? Now, some of that information we can get from remote sensing through the methods that I've described, but at some point you're also going to need to send out people in field to gather the necessary data. We've seen that some cities like Malmo have done this, and they have a tree database with a lot of this information, only for publicly managed trees, but nonetheless still very useful. On the other hand, apps like this could allow that process to work faster, more efficiently, and with more robustness. So professional users of the app might be able to do more, get through more in one day. On the other hand, you could also make this app available to citizens who could help with that effort, including measuring trees in their own gardens. So you're not just making data more current and improving its update rate, but also potentially more comprehensive over space. Another approach which would potentially be relevant on a professional basis would be to consider creating an urban equivalent to the Martello scope. The Martello scope is essentially a set of test plots which have been set out around France for commercial forestry, where a complete forest survey has been done, and this is connected to a 3D model. The model can be used to train foresters to understand not only the differing outcomes between traditional and sustainable management practices, but also what the result might look like, and this is already in active use. In terms of apps to involve citizens, I'll have to hold my hands up and confess that I've never much liked virtual reality. Firstly, because I find that the visuals tend to be of a world that's a little bit too bright, a little bit too clean, and a little bit too simplistic. But also because it tends to make me nauseous. Augmented reality, on the other hand, allows you to remain embedded in the real world and just add new elements into it. And this is a very interesting and useful approach, I think, particularly because you don't need to be encased in goggles. You can use this with ordinary mobile phones. This particular app was designed to help co-creation of greening to schoolyards in America. And that's a great idea. I'm sure it's very engaging. On the other hand, I do wonder about the wisdom of encouraging children to place fully grown trees into schoolyards when they will be well into adulthood before such a tree could have grown to that condition. On the other hand, maybe the lesson is less about planning the schoolyard than the value of planting trees in whose shade they themselves may never sit. The natural endpoint for these developments is their coming together in a digital twin. Now, these tend to divide opinion. Personally, I've also to date not been much of a fan of digital twinning for the same concern that I have about virtual reality. They seem to invest a lot of effort into impressive visuals, but these tended to be a little bit on the clean side and a little bit on the simplistic side. More to the point, the effort going into those visuals isn't going into analytical decision support models. However, when it comes to citizen engagement, the visual aspect should not be underestimated. And in projects such as this one from MIT, the objective is to combine visualization with functional models, something that is, as explained earlier, now feasible in real time thanks to AI. But if you're seeing this and just thinking it looks like yet another piece of technology that you have to somehow work into your life and your job, you are by no means alone. In 2015, we ran a survey as part of a project for Naturvårdsverket, where we asked municipalities, planning departments in municipalities across Sweden, what they were already doing in terms of using modelling to support their planning decisions. If they weren't using it, why not? What are the barriers? And how did they see this being useful for them in future? The general message that came back was that yes, they absolutely understood the value of models and they wanted the evidence-based decision support that it could provide. But in order for the models to be used effectively, ideally this would be in-house and they would be simple enough to get relatively quick answers, ones that they could understand and ones that they could control. The more complicated models they were having to give out to consultancies, and that's fine on an individual case, but it produces a friction in terms of transaction costs, not just the fees, but also licensing, legal issues, and just time for this process to occur, contracting and so on. So what they were really needing was the simpler end of models that they could use within their own processes. That feedback really made me rethink the priorities of my own research and in particular the way I write software, because so much environmental modelling is about achieving precision, but planning decisions very rarely depend on the precision of any one particular factor to X number of decimal places. Flood modelling to a particular height to the nearest centimetre is unlikely to be determining the ultimate decision of whether or not a development gets the go-ahead or whether certain areas are zoned certain ways. Instead, the planning process overall is trying to take into account a lot of different competing priorities, such as the various sustainable development goals, environmental legislation, political priorities, and so on. And the problem is that, yes, we have technology that can support decision making in any one or probably every one of those particular areas. But it's not reasonable to expect planning departments to be able to either go to each of those different software solutions to get the information they need, or indeed fund contracts to various different consultants, each of whom are specializing in one, two, maybe three of those sub-discipline areas. What we need to do is, first of all, make sure that the software is simple enough to be used in-house. And secondly, start to build it in such a way that it has consistency across the different domains, the different themes against which decisions need to be made. So this particular software I'm working on at the moment is called NICER. It's for an EU project called NICE. And the project as a whole is trying to understand how to develop better nature-based approaches to cleaning urban water. And this model is about connecting those different potential solutions together with the various potential sources of pollution in order to see how effective a particular design could be at an individual building level, maybe at the size of a block of apartments, right the way up to an entire catchment. The way software has been designed traditionally, those things might have ended up in different kinds of software with different underlying operating principles. NICER tries to bring that together and puts it all behind either a QGIS interface if you need the larger scale catchment work, or a simple Excel spreadsheet if you're working at the smaller scales. So I hope that this design decision will mean that it gets used in-house where it is most needed, and can be queried as often as needed to see what the best solution would be against a broad range of possible options. So this is not me standing on a soapbox espousing the value of the latest new technologies and saying, you know, come on, catch up, let's do this. Because it wasn't until I asked the question myself through that survey that I understood why it was that all of these marvelous modeling approaches that we had to support decision making didn't seem to be really feeding through to the front line in the end. At the end of the day, asking for directions is something we don't like to do, because if we do that, we have to listen and maybe go somewhere where we weren't necessarily planning to go. And I think that's the answer, right? If we want to engage with an environment which is changing at an unprecedented rate, not just in terms of the rate at which we're creating new data, new technologies and new methods for analysing them, but also the rate at which society is adopting that around us, which, as I've shown in this lecture, is a new phenomenon. Typically, a new technical innovation takes a long time before society is willing to both use it and grant it influence within our decision-making process. Suddenly, all of this is happening almost simultaneously. So I think that we need to learn to be better at asking each other for directions. The GIS side of things, the modeling side of things, how should we do this better to make it useful for you? And the practice side of things, saying, we're doing it this way, can you suggest a better way of doing that? In particular, I think having a common language that we all understand is really important. Now, we teach at SLU course called Advanced Digital Landscape Analysis with GIS. The course is just running at the moment, and we have mostly planning students and landscape architecture students on that course learning how to do geospatial analysis. And what I always say to them is, look, it may well be that when you go into your eventual job, you do not end up using GIS yourself on a regular basis. But what you need to understand is that you will be able to communicate better with the people who are doing those processes. You'll be able to use words like raster and vector and know their respective benefits and why the other person is suggesting one way of doing it rather than another, for example. Learning that language will allow the flow of information to go to and fro and make the process by which we handle these changes in technology more flexible. So as a team, we're able to absorb the impact of the waves as they come in. And that also does depend to some extent on the organization around you, making sure that, that things are in place. But above all, it also means being a little gentle with ourselves and with each other and recognizing things are changing very fast. If you want people to do things differently and to try and get on that surfboard, you have to accept they're going to fall off in the process of learning. Learning from mistakes has to be an accepted part of the process in a way that maybe it didn't need to be 20 years ago because tried and tested best practice was a sufficient way to handle the next step. So I hope that's given you some food for thought about what your options might be and how to go about getting to know each other's language and ways of thinking a bit better so we're ready for all these new opportunities. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can send them to me by email at this address. Thanks for listening.